anything that came up that seemed like more than one person thought was something they want to hear about? Because I do have a lot of material I can share, but I'm just curious what your thoughts are.
I'll jump in that for group 2. One of the issues was, and I brought it up, so is that we usually run our session meetings, and that's about the only meeting that we have that ever works with any sort of formality, by consensus. It's just much easier that way. And so the question becomes, at what point do you know you should be switching maybe to some more formal structure of using, Mr. and Ms. Moderator, and somebody there becomes a resident parliamentarian, and you need to follow these because maybe the debate's getting contentious, or maybe because you're talking about a legal issue or something like that. How do you know when to switch back and forth, or should you?
Right, that's a good question.
Another question that came up in that group was the idea of how do you bring somebody back when they have, without being rude and interrupting, to the order of the day, point of order. If you don't have a point of order person in your
Right.
in your session.
Mm-hmm.
Yes. Okay. I forget, there's a word for that person. What was it? I can't remember, that some parliamentarian came up with that was polite.
Helpful.
I'm not thinking of the word, not for the helpful person, but for the person that is someone said windbag. I think that might be a little bit too pejorative. So I didn't say that. Let's erase the tape. Other thoughts, questions, things we might spend our time talking about?
Several people in the first group were interested in the abbreviated rules, Robert's rules, for small groups.
Okay, that would be good. We could certainly work on that.
Where does one even find those rules?
Well, they're in the middle of a very long book. That's the real funny part.
Tell you how much I've read Robert's Rules of Order.
We could talk about that as well. Yeah, they're on page 464 of a 714-page book. How's that? Other thoughts, other questions that we might want to cover? Well, there could be more that come up, and why don't we start with, I think the three topics that we brought up are actually really appropriate to speak of together. So I'm just going to share my screen to show you what I put there. And I'm going to kind of give an overview of that. So anyway, okay, I'm not sure what's going on, but I think if we say we want to talk about abbreviated rules for small groups, then that's going to raise a couple of questions. One is, if you're using the abbreviated rules, that first bullet point is, when do you change because debate becomes contentious or there's a legal issue where you really want to make sure that you have something that stands up in court or at the bank or wherever. And also under abbreviated rules, as you'll discover, it can become more difficult to bring someone back to the point of the conversation or the point of the meeting, okay? So let's see. I'm going to put up my copy of the abbreviated rules, which I had ready to go. Okay, here it is. Let's. So we'll start with that, and then we'll hit those other two questions. So I'm going to share my screen again. And can you read that? Is that large enough?
Yes.
Okay, so what Robert's Rules of Order has is they have something called rules for small boards. And for a long time, they've had these rules for a long time because Robert's Rules of Order is written for any size of meeting. They have particular rules for, say, conventions. And often conventions have thousands of people trying to, process business. So those rules are very different than rules for like a membership meeting of 100 people or 200 or 50. And they also came up with something called rules for small boards. in which they say, in a board meeting where there are not more than about a dozen members present, which is like, what do you mean about a dozen? Can't you create a firm rule, Roberts? That's what you're good about. Roberts has always been good about creating firm rules rather than suggestions. But they've got this. The rules governing such meetings are different from the rules that hold in other assemblies in the following respects. And we can look at those in a second. What I want to say is that part of the issue with rules for small boards, and what you'll hear more folks, even the Robert's Rules of Order authors will say now, since I've heard them, is you probably want to adopt these rules, whatever the size of your board, or modify them for your context, because there's no perfect set of rules that work for every group. As one parliamentarian told me, parliamentarian, someone who tries to study and understand the rules of meeting procedure, basically said that it's not, when it's small board, he says, don't think about it small in terms of the number of people. Think about it in terms of the amount of, contention. Is there a lot of business that there's a lot of disagreement on? Doesn't mean people don't like each other, but there's just a lot of things that people are going to disagree about. Well, you might have 6 people that have a lot of disagreements that maybe the small board rules aren't going to work in that situation. On the other hand, rules for small boards, I've been in groups of over 20 people where the rules for small boards work just perfectly. And yes, there was disagreement. Yes, there was debate, but it worked most of the time and really well. So really quickly, here are the rules for small boards. Down here, I'm going to pull that up to where you can see. There's basically 7 rules. I've paraphrased a little bit from Robert's Rules of Order, and I could have cited chapter and verse in Robert's Rules of Order. There's a new Robert's Rules of Order that it's not that new. It came out in 2020, the most current edition. It's called the 12th edition. And so here are the rules. One rule is members may raise a hand instead of standing when seeking recognition to speak, and remain seated when speaking or making motions. So in a larger meeting, you always had the idea that someone got up and said, moderator, or Mr. Chair or Madam Chair, and then they would be recognized. They realized in smaller meetings, often you're at a boardroom table and people are sitting down, and it's a small group, so people are just raising their hands instead of standing up. You'll see at the last point too, number 7, if the chair is a member of the board, then the chair can speak and debate without leaving the chair and may vote on all questions. And also, number 6, the chairman need not, this is the language we would use, chair probably, but the chair need not rise while putting a question to a vote. So you've lost some of that formality that you would normally have, but also because you're generally in a smaller group, you don't need people standing up. If you're in a group of 200 people, you well may need that, especially if you don't have cameras and things and big screens. So I think that's part of it. That's stuff that doesn't really affect stuff. Here's one: motions need not be seconded. Seconds are something that people love because they understand them and they're fun, but parliamentarians are like, seconds are they're not all that important. In fact, Robert's Rules of Order says the purpose of a second is just to help the presiding person, like the moderator or chair, determine whether more than one person cares about something, so you don't waste the assembly's time talking about something. But here it just says in small boards, and in fact in committees, Robert's Rules of Order says seconds aren't important. This says motions don't need to be second. And I'm going to circle back to that because there's something else that happens further down. But there's no limit on the number of times a member can speak to a debatable question. Oops. So number 3, in a larger meeting, you would say that a member can only speak twice to a debatable question. And then after they speak once, they can only speak a second time after everyone who has spoken, everyone who wants to speak has spoken. So someone speaks once in a big meeting, and then they raise their hand to speak again, or they stand to seek recognition. The presiding person would say, I see you, Paul, you want to speak again. Is there anyone else that wants to speak before Paul speaks a second time? Under the board rules, often you allow people to speak multiple times, and often they make smaller speeches. They just kind of pipe in and say, oh, I just want to correct something, or you know, it's 2 or 3 words. So for some boards that could be terrifying, because we've talked about what do you do with someone who likes to speak and, you know, often is off topic. Number 4 as well, informal discussion of a subject is permitted while no motion is pending. This happens all the time in small boards. If it happens in a 100-person meeting, it can get really distracting, and the presiding person is going to say, until there's a motion on the floor, it's out of order to just kind of talk about what are we going to do about the grounds outside. But in a small meeting, you know, someone says, I've been thinking about the front of the church. It's looking a little shabby. I'm wondering if, you know, maybe we just need to spruce up the landscaping and even put some paint on there. In fact, I move that we hire a painter. They've actually been discussing and, you know, saying because of the shabby landscape, the shabby appearance of the front of the church, that's the debate on a motion. But it's informal discussion. And often several people are talking about things, right, in small meetings. You've seen this before, I imagine. And then someone comes up with a motion like, well, now we've identified the problem. Here's the motion. Well, at that point, if you've permitted informal discussion, and then you say, well, now we have a motion, we need a second. It's like, not really. Clearly, more than one person's been interested in this. We've had a discussion for 15 minutes and now, so that's part of the reason why motions need not be seconded in small boards, is because there's already been debate. Seconds have nothing to do with the legality of any issue in terms of parliamentary law in the United States. So just so you know that. So I just can't stand it when people are asking about seconds. But anyway, they have their point, especially when someone brings something up and there is no second in a much larger meeting, that then we don't have to worry about talking about the space aliens who we need to provide, you know, seating for in the back of the hall. This says here, when a proposal is perfectly clear to all present, a vote can be taken without a motion having been introduced. I don't really know exactly what that means. I mean, I guess as long as everyone's clear on what you're voting on, you don't need someone else to make the motion. Often the person that's leading the meeting, the presider, the chair, the moderator, can assume the motion and say, well, I hear everyone talking about, you know, having this work party, and I've heard it could be next Sunday after church. If you're in favor of a work party next Sunday after church, you know, that's what we're voting on. Say aye, say no, and that. Okay, so we didn't have a motion. We didn't have someone make a motion, someone make a second, and have debate. We just knew, because we're in a smaller group, that we're able to do that without affecting business. Business may be more efficient if we do it that way in a small group. Then we go through all of the steps of Robert's Rules of Order for a larger meeting. Okay, so then again, the chair need not rise while putting a question to a vote, and chairs often in small boards will speak and vote on all questions. So in a larger meeting, chairs are supposed to show impartiality. They have they have the right to vote and they have the right to debate, but they also have the duty to be impartial and to show impartiality, which means in larger meetings, the chair shouldn't vote unless it's a secret ballot or unless it's a deciding vote, which is kind of odd because when it's a deciding vote, clearly half the people or close to half the people are going to disagree with you. That's why your vote is the decider. But the rules are designed under Robert's Rules to try to balance two competing at this point ideals. One is to have an impartial chair, but two is to protect the rights of the assembly and the chair to vote. And so on. So otherwise, also, right, in a larger meeting, if a chair really wants to debate something, they're supposed to leave. They're supposed to have someone else preside over the meeting, and they leave the chair, and then they, you know, go to a microphone or whatever, and they debate. And then the person that's presiding probably also takes the vote, so it's all impartial. But anyway, you don't want to know about that. You want to know about in a small meeting, right? So again, I think for most sessions, these sorts of rules would work great. And a couple of things you could do. I think you probably should just create a special rules of order, which are not bylaws. I wouldn't put them in the bylaws. I would say, like, you have your bylaws for your congregation, and then you would have something that you could put in your manual of operations, like another page after that says special rules of order for session. The session shall follow these rules, and you could have some or all of those rules that I came up with, that I showed, I didn't come up with, they came from Robert's Rules of Order. You might want to get rid of one of two of them just because you see problems coming. I have a couple questions, and I got someone I need to admit. So Priscilla, welcome. You have a question.
Thank you. I'm sorry I was a little bit late because I had another appointment. What you just showed us on screen, are you going to provide that to us in a document that we could print?
I have that document, and after this meeting, I can send out a link to a folder that will have that document in it. And I think I have another document in there that suggests how to, oh boy, how to do that, or how to create special rules.
Okay.
So I will have that for you, and it will be called Small Board Rules for Sessions. I just called it for sessions. Clearly, it could be for other groups as well, but
Sure. Okay.
in fact, it could be,
that.
yeah. In fact, it could be for some smaller congregations that have congregational meeting. You might already be using these rules by default, and you're like, oh, I feel like it's such a bad thing. We're not following Robert's Rules of Order. Well, actually, you are. You're just following small board rules, right? You're not following rules that were designed for something much different. So Robert's Rules understands that and came up with these rules. So Rick, question.
On the issue of if the vote, if the motion is clearly understood, as a clerk, sometimes I feel the need to report to the session what I am writing down as the motion, just to make sure that what appears in the minutes is actually what was clearly understood by the whole group.
Yes, I appreciate that. In fact, I think that rule, the way it's stated in Robert's Rules of Order, is not helpful. I think you always want to make sure, and it's not a bad thing for a clerk to interrupt and say, I just want to make sure I got this right. This is what we were voting on. This is what we voted on. Is that correct? Because it's so easy to miss something, or someone else say, that's not what I thought we voted on. I thought the exact opposite. I heard a no in there, and you're saying there wasn't a no. Like, it's good to catch that in the meeting rather than wait a month. And then people can't even, I can't remember what happened last week, let alone last month. So great point, Rick. I think some of these rules, I can understand why they're suggested, but I also am not sure that I would follow them. And people often do make changes to Robert's Rules of Order, and Robert's Rules of Order encourages that. They say, these are rules that we think work in general best, but we know everyone's got different things that happen. So other questions on that? We had two other, I think, related questions. And one was, at what point do you switch to more formal structure? And that might be something to put in your rules as well. And I haven't really thought of how I would do that, but I'm going to make a note of that, and I'll come up with some language. It seems like at a certain point, things get a little contentious and the informal rules, let's say, are not working well. It would seem like the chair or a member, the moderator of session or a member would say, moderator, things are getting contentious. I suggest we go to more formal rules. Now, the more formal rules may not include standing up to make your point. Maybe you're still sitting down. So what are those rules? We're only gonna, we're gonna go to, we need to have a motion on the floor before we have debate. And we're also gonna talk about the rules of decorum, which I didn't prepare for this, but we should probably have rules of decorum that we share with the session about how you address issues and trying to avoid names. And sometimes it seems, especially in small groups, it seems really odd if there's 4 people at the table and you say, the previous speaker said, we all know the previous speaker was, Beth, right? So, but sometimes it really does help to keep issues impersonal by not using people's names and by not attacking personalities, right? We don't say, well, I think that, Paul has, he's half-baked and really probably missed school on that day when we talked about these things. No, we talk about the issue. I disagree with the previous speaker. I think their idea is completely stupid. Actually, that's okay because you're talking about the idea, not the person. Same time, I'm not sure using stupid is a really helpful adjective in any context, but maybe I haven't watched enough politics. So
I think, can
yeah.
I say, Paul, along that line, I think it really helps that members don't address each other, that they always address the moderator or the chair. That tends to cut down on those kind of cross-talking.
Right. And I think it's not clear in informal discussion if that's permitted or not to talk outside of the chair. We all know in smaller groups, often in smaller committees especially, there's a lot of that sort of crosstalk. And sometimes that's okay, depending. But I think, Chris, you make a really good point of even with informal discussion, it can still always go through the chair. And I would hold that as probably the best practice. It seems a little ridiculous at times until you get to a point where someone says something that they probably later regret, and everything erupts and people are like, what just happened here? Why did someone say something that brought a lot of anxiety and contention into a meeting? So yes, always going addressing through the chair. Other thoughts on Wendy, would you change because debate is contentious? In terms of legally, I don't think there's an issue with legal issues. Unanimous consent is fine for any vote. Which is there any objection? You don't even take a vote per se. Is there any objection to us amending our bylaws? No objection. We're going to amend them. Minutes of meetings, at least since 1926, and I bet before, General Robert of Robert's Rules of Order said, you should never have a motion to approve minutes. Minutes should be approved by unanimous consent. The only way to vote against minutes is to propose a different set of minutes or to propose a different amendment. So, are there any objections to approving the minutes? Well, first you'd say, are there any corrections? The person would bring up corrections. And then generally, you might have to vote on an amendment to the minutes, but you would always just say, if there's no objection, the minutes are approved as whether they were corrected or they were presented, right? So those sorts of things are substantiated, actually in common law going back years, centuries. So there's really not, I don't think there's ever a reason to go to shift to more formal structure, aside from you want to be very clear on what you're voting for. And if there's sort of this informal thing, and often, well, yeah, we said communion is the first Sunday of the month, except in March, we said the third Sunday, and we didn't, maybe not everyone heard it, but if it's more legal, yeah, you want to make sure everyone knows what they're voting on so someone doesn't contest that. Now, how would you bring someone back to the point if you permitted informal discussion outside of motion? So someone starts, talking about, last Sunday, I was at the potluck afterwards. I noticed there sure seemed to be a lot of desserts and not a lot of main dishes. And I've been thinking about that. And that reminds me of when I was a child, how much I loved desserts. Funny aside, ... How do you bring folks back? Any thoughts on that? Chuck, you're muted. That's one way to prevent those things. You mute the person if it's an electronic meeting. Chuck.
Yeah, actually, I wanted to talk about something else. So.
Go ahead. Or did you have something else? Or
yeah, actually, are there any tips on setting up consent agendas that make it different for a larger group or a smaller group?
I think the tips would be there's two schools of thought on consent agendas. One, some people would say you could put every item in the meeting on the consent agenda, and then people will pull off the things that are most important. Now, if you have a lot of business, that's a bad idea, right? If you're in a large meeting or convention and you have 20 items of business, that requires someone to scratch their head through a lot of stuff. That doesn't seem appropriate. It also is not appropriate if people are not really familiar with consent agendas. And suddenly later in the meeting, it's like, wait, why didn't we talk? Or like after the meeting, they're like, weren't we supposed to talk about X? Well, yeah, it was on the consent agenda and you didn't say anything, therefore it passed. So generally the rule is with the consent agenda is you're looking for things that are non-controversial. And I actually have a document that talks a little bit about that. It's a 2-pager that someone put together. Non-controversial things, minutes can go on the consent agenda. If you always every year approve communion on the first Sunday of the month or whatever, that seems like a great consent agenda thing. So there's a little bit of the art of it, right? The person putting the agenda together is hoping they're not putting wild and crazy things on there that someone's gonna like, you put X on the consent agenda, now I worry about everything you put on the consent agenda. So you don't want to put controversial things on there intentionally, unless you say, hey, I put everything on the consent agenda. I know some of them are controversial. I'm not sure which ones are. Pull off every one you want. I mean, that's one way some groups have done the consent agenda. Again, I think there's dangers there. But if you knew your group well, they've been around a long time, it's 8 or 10 people, you can imagine a case where that could be a good way to go. I don't know if I've answered your question though, but
Yeah, that's good. Thanks.
okay. Probably went on too long, so thank you. Eileen.
I've struggled with consent agendas because of people not understanding how they work or questioning it later. Well, I thought we were going to talk about, and what I've tried to move toward instead is the unanimous consent vote. Are there any objections to this motion? And that goes pretty quickly, but they still feel like they have an opportunity and a specific time to do that. It's fresh in my mind because in January, we do a lot of pretty routine election business and setting schedule business and that kind of stuff. And I thought about a consent agenda, but then I thought about the time I'd have to spend explaining a consent agenda and decided that a unanimous consent where we take them one at a time, but we roll through them, was smoother for our group anyway.
That's a great alternative to either a consent agenda or bringing things up and saying, is there any discussion, debate, but just say, instead you're just reframing it as, is there any objection? Now, if someone objects, then there's the opportunity for debate, discussion, whatever you want to call that, in a formal vote that, allows for yeses and nos. So I like that. It's sort of a middle ground and it saves time. And yes. Vicky.
I was just along that same line. I see that annual renewal that usually happens in January for us is a time to educate the new session members on what their responsibility is to oversee also. So it's just an educational opportunity.
Right. Good. And I was just realizing, every meeting is different in terms of, or there's different kinds of meetings. One is, if you have a session meeting and that session is fairly stable and there's going to be the same people for, a year, and then there's probably some folks rotating off, it's easier theoretically to have something like a consent agenda, spend some time up front in the first month explaining how that works. Sometimes with consent agendas, in that case, I have put something on the consent agenda that doesn't belong there, and then I've pulled it off myself to show people, right, to demonstrate, like, I didn't put that on there to pull the wool over your eyes in any way. I was doing that to show, to model, right? Now, at a Presbyterian meeting, it's a little more confusing because every Presbyterian meeting is a new meeting, and then some people join halfway through the meeting. So we have to balance, like, making sure everyone knows what's going on in a meeting, 200 people, versus before every vote explaining how everything works in terms of voting, which could really slow down the meeting. So there's always that balance. And Beth had a conversation in meeting chat about, what to do if someone goes off topic, and, thanks very much for sharing about your interest in desserts. So you're putting it in a parking lot to discuss later, or offer to address it with that person. And that brings me up to a point that I recall hearing someone tell me once that I used, was by saying, like, our meeting is from 7 to 8:30, but I'm going to stick around after the meeting and we can stick around and talk about other things outside of the meeting business. So someone in informal discussion goes, that reminds me that, so-and-so's mother's in the hospital. Has anyone heard how they're doing? And so on. And at that point, maybe someone makes a really brief remark, like, they're doing fine. It's an interesting story, and I'd love to tell you after our adjournment. And then people know they're going to stick around, or have time before the meeting where people come to talk. Because I think there's at least two types of people that go to meetings. Some folks are coming to meetings, especially at churches and things, and they're so delighted to see folks and they want to have a conversation. And this is a good social time for them. And nothing wrong with that. And then there are other people like, we're here for the business. And so I remember I had one person that the session at my church was very much into like chatting about everything, and they loved it. And we had one person come and goes, by the second meeting, Paul, this is ridiculous. We need to get through the business. So I decided to create this whole system. And the funny thing is, the next meeting, I create this whole system, and he interrupts the meeting in the middle and goes, hey, I'm just wondering how so-and-so's doing, which was kind of funny. Like, I was like, wait, I did this to protect your rights, and now you don't want your rights protected. Like, I don't know what to do. Anyway, people are complicated, and they get to change, and that's fine. So yes, and Beth, I appreciate that as well. Your second comment, I think everyone can see that. And often that's wise to redirect and say, this is not appropriate, but right now we need to get through this item, and then that we can come back to that either under different business or so on, right? So one of the things Robert's Rules of Order says is that when you're talking about a topic, it's the discussion needs to be germane. It needs to be about that topic. And so if it's not, it's out of order. And one thing that should always be said by people who are like chairing a meeting is, instead of saying you are out of order, people are never out of order. Well, sometimes they are, but generally they're not out of order. What they're saying is out of order at this time, right? Just by changing it to, it's not that what you're saying is out of order, it's just out of order at this time. Right now we're talking about putting a new roof on the church. You're talking about your favorite potluck, and we're going to talk about that either later because that's going to come up under the social report, or after the meeting, let's talk about it because I love food too, right? So that's kind of a helpful tip, is to say at this time, so that we're not telling people that they're out of order. And people may take your comments personally. Yes. Okay. And I like, yes, and Eileen, you're pointing out even on Zoom, you can hang out afterwards. You can also say, the meeting starts at 7 o'clock, but come early at 6:30 and, for our virtual coffee time or whatever. So there are ways kind of before and after the meeting to accommodate folks that just want to get business done, and others who do want to have a chance to socialize. And there's a balance there, right? I mean, I think if you just try to get business done, you lose some of the social capital of people getting to know each other. So often early in a meeting, there's a reason we start with prayer. And often, people would start with songs or things like that. If you sing together, that creates community bonds. You play a game together, that creates community bonds, which can help move business forward. So there's lots of things you can do. Majority rule with minority rights. Yes. And that can be harder on the Zoom format. Yes. The right to feel heard. And that is actually, that is a right of everyone to debate. It's not an absolute right. So, people will call the question in a meeting, which means there's a vote to determine whether we're going to end debate. And that requires a 2/3 vote. And the reason it's 2/3 and not minority is you're trying to balance the minority, or the right of everyone to speak, with the right of the majority to not have to hear everyone speak and be there for 7 hours. So they had to make some compromises and say, human nature being what it is, we want to give a right, but we don't want to make it absolute. And Zoom, yeah, that creates some challenges, right? The electronic meetings and how people feel heard. One rule I saw that was suggested for small boards was no one can close debate until every member of the board has spoken. And that makes sense. If you've got a board of, 10 to 12, 15 people, you're really probably not going to lose a lot if allowing everyone to speak before someone closes debate. In a meeting of 100 people, if you say no one can close debate until everyone has spoken, that might, depending on the group, that might not be the best course of action for people that like to get to bed at a reasonable hour. So you can see there's always balancing things. Okay.
Hey,
Other
Paul,
questions? If you have a question, you can raise your hand, but I do see a question here about encouraging everyone to share their video.
can I just make a quick comment
Sure.
about,
You're out of order,
Um,
Chris, at
I'm
this
out of
time.
order.
But now I'm going to allow it. Go ahead.
Okay, you're very generous. One of the things, and it occurred to me when you were talking, that at the end of a meeting, I forget where I first saw it, but they encourage everyone to unmute so that everybody can talk in kind of a cacophony after the meeting is done. So you get kind of that interrelationship. And I really like the feel of that. It tends to make more of a sense that we're all together rather than we're just muted.
Yeah, thanks.
Use it or not.
I think that's a great idea. And Lori has this tip about giving folks a chance to check in. And that's not just Lori. I think a lot of folks in terms of meeting management say, you know, allowing people to check in, asking people what they're bringing to the meeting really helps people frame the meeting and become more self-aware of themselves and others. And wow, okay, you've got even more. Wow, created a space for someone to share. They just received a cancer diagnosis. And I'll bet that changed the tenor of the meeting in terms of what's really important, right? We often argue about things that in the larger scope of things, if we have some perspective, we realize that helps to de-escalate. So thank you, that is great. A lot of good comments there in the chat. And I can save that meeting chat and pass it on if you don't want to take notes on all of that. Anything else? Other thoughts? Beth, do I see your hand up?
Yeah, I just wanted the part about sharing the video.
Yeah.
It's not an experience in a session meeting, but for the whole Barbie's Village thing, you know, that our church was involved in, we had a lot of house meetings, and there were some contentious discussions, and people that didn't want to be identified just didn't share their video, and that's kind of where I'm coming from. I mean, if I just think it would be great if people, unless they're like really have an issue with sharing how they look at a certain time. I think it's good because then you can get at some of the nonverbal views and cues, and it's a little bit closer to actually being in person. But I think that's my preference. You know, if people don't want to, they have the right to not share.
Right. And I do know groups have different rules on that. So for instance, some people may join a Zoom meeting by telephone, so then they have no video capability. But this one group, I didn't quite understand how their rule worked, because they're like, if they're on their phone, we're gonna call them, and if they don't pick up their phone, we're gonna dismiss them from the meeting. Or it made no sense to me. But anyway, the idea was that you would put it, the moderator, the host of the meeting can put names on people, so at least we know who's at the meeting, right? Not just we're going to call on 503, 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, or whatever. We're going to have a name. That helps. I mean, right, you're just trying to do the best you can. But others have said, no, everyone needs to join in a way that they can show their video. Now, what happens if someone says, I'd love to show my video, but I have very low bandwidth here, and I'm just trying to hear what you're saying, right? So then do you say, well, I'm sorry, tough luck, or do you say, oh, we hear you, we understand? You probably would say we understand at this point. And I think it all depends on the type of meeting. You're right, in larger meetings, that is one of the challenges of video. The other interesting thing, and with video compared to, let's say, a meeting of 100 people, someone gets up to address the chair and you're in a meeting of 100 people, do you have an opportunity to see their body language? You may or may not. What if you're sitting behind them? I mean, I guess you'll see some of their body language, right? But you're not going to see their facial expression. So I think we've always had these, they're not solely related to electronic meetings, though they are certainly, more common. So I think you have a really good point. And I also think, there's probably cautions, and everyone's going to have a different place where they land on it. Yeah. And a clerk saying it's easier to record minutes in person rather than on Zoom. Yeah, interesting. I I think
And
that's
she
probably
she
true for some.
travels the furthest of the group
Ah,
and has said that it works better for her to do that. So
Hmm.
just something I hadn't thought about, and I thought it was important to honor.
That's
Good
kind of,
point.
that's kind of interesting because I almost prefer Zoom for recording minutes, but then I type quickly and type notes and then can weed them out later. So that's very interesting, and thanks for the reminder, Lori.
I thought that it was a good thing about assumptions that we make, that some things are better than others, and I don't know, that's, it's different for different people.
And I think some people are more willing to speak on Zoom than in person, and vice versa. So I think that it's not necessarily that one is better than the other. One is perhaps more advantageous for some than for others, but it's really hard to find, the ideal technology. Or, I mean, I think it's all technology, right? Even meeting for a meeting in person requires some sort of technology. Someone designed a chair that you sat on. Anyway, other thoughts? Other
Something that we
questions?
might consider, I ran in across somebody on a day when I had several Zoom, or a week when I had several Zoom meetings, and they said, "Oh, I've never done one of those." And I was like taken aback, but there are people of all ilks and ages who are not as comfortable as we might tend to be with this format. We've come out of the, pandemic thinking, "Oh, everybody knows how to do this now." That's not necessarily true.
Right. And my favorite anecdote was people who I'd say, we're having a Zoom meeting for Presbytery. So it's a little bit of a larger meeting, and we need, we're gonna have some training on how to interact in this meeting. And these people would say, "Oh, Paul, I know all about Zoom." And they did. They would have these amazing, elaborate backgrounds. They knew all this stuff, but they couldn't figure out how to raise their hand, which was like a fundamental thing they needed in order to seek recognition, right? So they knew all these bells and whistles that they used with their family, but they probably never had to raise their hand when they were, on a call with their, brothers and sisters, siblings, or whatever. So it's kind of funny what you know and what you think you know until you get to the meeting, and then you don't know. So I think a couple things came to mind I've forgotten, but any other questions, thoughts, things we can problem solve together?
I don't know if this helps anybody, but just recently at our January 1st meeting of the year of our session, we approved a budget, and I asked the person who presented the budget, our committee chair, whether she was more comfortable doing that, or if she was as comfortable doing that on a Zoom format as she would be in person. And she had a definite idea that she would rather do it in person and pass around the paper budget so that people had that. And that was the kind of meeting that even though it's the dark of the year and some people weren't particularly motivated to come out, that asking her what her comfort level was one of the things. I surprise myself sometimes in thinking up something smart, but it was good to ask her. And if she had and it was actually during one of the ICE weeks. And if I'd said, "Oh, well, we'll meet on Zoom instead," and she wasn't comfortable making that presentation, that would have not been a good situation.
So one way to help people with meetings is to avoid making assumptions about what their comfort level is and what would be the best practice. Yeah. Chuck.
Just a quickie, because I have to present the budget to the session tonight in 4 hours. You also have to be aware that some people hear better on Zoom meetings than they do in person. I have a hearing problem, and at certain frequencies, it's fairly severe. I struggle oftentimes with in-person meetings because the room is echoey, or there's two conversations going on at once, or other things like that. And sometimes I find Zoom meetings to be much better because people are sequential. They're being picked up on a microphone. There's, everybody's aware of background noises. So it's with the exception of my squeaky chair today, this has been pretty quiet. So people have the different reasons, and you sort of have to take some of that in, even with in-person meetings, to make sure, because the demographic that we represent in churches, our church is 2/3 elderly people, basically. And there's all sorts of issues with hearing, vision, etc. Be sensitive to that.
Yeah, it's good point. Yeah. And then there's the whole idea of having the hybrid meeting, which allows some people to be in person and some people to be online. And often with a hybrid meeting, well, that's not actually not always true, but you might have an amplification in the room, right? But you might not. Small enough group, you would just have your laptop microphone or something. But yeah, it's just really hard to figure out the ideal setting. But it's great. We have all these options now to discuss at the next meeting about how we're going to meet.
Paul, will you be sending package of stuff out after this to people who are here, or are you going to post it and let anybody come to whatever you put out and say, hey, it's here, come get it? Because
yeah,
I know
actually the answer is yes. So I'll send it to all of you because I think you've all registered, so we should have your email. And I will probably make a couple of changes to some of the documents. For instance, one of them I realized had a word in it I needed to remove. And I'll try to tailor some of that. So I will send it out probably in the next, let's say in the next 24 hours. And some of the things we discussed, and also some other things that I think would be helpful that we didn't discuss that you can look at. You can always email me and ask me questions. Some of you know that I use a lot of my continuing education to go to parliamentary procedure workshops, which means I'm a kind of a nerd, I guess. But so any question you have about meetings or weird motions that you can make in Robert's Rules of Order, I would love to talk about. So let's see. Here's something that might be fun. Maybe not. But I came up with what I call some unnecessary motions to make. So often someone will be in a meeting, they will give a report, and someone will move to receive the report. Well, guess what? You just received the report. They gave it. So that's an unnecessary motion. Also, to adopt a financial report is actually not only unnecessary, but it could be problematic. You only should adopt financial reports that were audited. So only audited, or if there's a financial review, that would be helpful to do because then you are protecting your treasurer or whoever's giving that report. A motion to accept the minutes, as I said earlier, is usually an unnecessary motion. Of course, if the chair is waiting for a motion to accept the minutes, by all means, please make that motion as soon as possible so we don't have to explain to the chair why they didn't need to make the motion. And if there's a point of order, was there a second? Almost always those are way after the fact when debate has already begun. And the requirement of a second is for the chair's guidance, whether to state the question on the motion and place it before the group. So those are just a few of the unnecessary motions that I came up with. And any thoughts on those? Anything that notes? I'm going to stop my sharing just so I can see everybody.
I say thank you for the minutes thing. We had a moderator who just befuddled me because for years and years we had not had a motion, and all of a sudden we had this person moving to approve the minutes, and what? So that's nice to know that that's official.
It is official, and actually, though, it's not entirely out of order to move to approve the minutes. I mean, I think usually it's just like if someone moves it and someone seconds it, it doesn't really require a second because someone goes, I don't want to talk about the minutes. Well, guess what? You're the board or you're the body. You have to approve minutes. So it really doesn't require a second.
Mhm.
You know, it might require a second if someone says, I postpone adopting the minutes till the next meeting. Well, then maybe we should find out if there's a second to that. But if you're in a much larger meeting, but in a smaller meeting, you know, you'd probably want to know why someone wants to postpone it. Well, I was at the meeting and these don't seem quite right. I think these are actually from the month before, but I can't remember. Can we, you know, can we find out where those December minutes really are, Rick? No, I don't think that's ever happened to Rick, but anyway, it's happened to me before where I've sent out the wrong minutes. Barbara Holloway. And we're on free time now, so you can leave if you need to. Barbara, I think you're muted.
Is this better?
It is, and I like how you're sharing your video, and yet we don't see your face. We see the
I
cat.
don't have any big picture here. I did everything, and all of a sudden I got that little guy come up. So he looks
this is
better than I do. No, there's a couple of things, and oh, God, I'm at the age what I even start this for. What were we just talking? Oh, the motion. Oh, I know. Right after I do my minutes, shortly within the week, you know, after we've met, I send an email out to everybody for corrections or additions. And this way they come in. If there's something that I have misinterpreted, they will help me with the wording. So by the time we come to session, it's already been screened and it's a pretty easy process. Another thing at another church before I came here, the clerk always requested the person making motions would have it in writing. So usually your motions come from committee, proposals or whatever you call it. But she would require us to have it written so that everybody would know exactly what was said and what we were voting on. I haven't been able to pull that off at my church. And there was one other thing, and we always have Zoom available for our in-person meetings because we have people that are travel and do a lot of things. So everybody is usually included unless there's an illness. So that's all I have to say.
Great. Well, I think once we got Zoom, suddenly more meetings could happen because people would say, well, I'm flying out that day, but I can join the meeting from the airport. And you're like, darn, now we have a quorum and I have to show up to this meeting. Like, we used to be able to get out of some of these meetings. Anyway, I like the idea of the minutes. So I think minutes, and I know that there's another, not Robert's Rules of Order, but the Standard Code is another meeting procedure guide. And they talk about, because now we have email and people can do this work much more efficiently and closer to the time of the meeting, right? The sooner you get to minutes, the more accurate they're going to be. So incidentally, Robert's Rules of Order says you should always approve minutes within a quarterly time frame, because so you have an annual congregational meeting and they don't meet again to the next year. You should have your session approve the minutes well before the next meeting. Now, at the next meeting, someone can say, hey, that you got something wrong, but and you can change the minutes there, but the idea is you don't want to wait a year because no one can remember what really happened. So find another way to do that. I think that there could be a way you could create something, and I think it gets a little challenging when you put out your minutes. Say, hey, any corrections? I mean, I think it's a great idea practice, but then I'm getting stuff and then I'm incorporating that into the minutes. And then before the next meeting, I send out, hey, all, here's the minutes as I think they are. You know, here's draft 2. This is what we're going to be approving at the meeting, because draft 1 had all those changes, right? So trying to figure out a way to make sure people are tracking on where you're at in the minutes approval process. That's one way to do it. And the other one was, yes, motions in writing. That is something that can always be actually, I guess, demanded by the chair of the meeting, the presiding officer. And I think that whenever a clerk says, can we get that in writing? Like whoever's chairing the meeting should say, absolutely. We want to make sure we get that right. So usually people say substantive motions or main motions need to be in writing. So if someone says, I move the previous question, we don't say, could you please put that in writing? You know, But it's longer ones, right, that need to be in writing. So any other thoughts, questions? I hope this was helpful. I had a good time, which is all that matters, right? Thanks for humoring me.
I've got to go.
Okay. Well, for all that need to go, you can go, but because we're going to practice good meeting procedure, if you want to hang out and talk about food or whatever, I'm here for the next 3 to 10 minutes.
Thanks, Paul.
All right. Good to see
God
you.
loves nerds.
I do think talking about food, I do think that we've instituted snack at our meetings. And it's another way that people tend to kind of just settle into the space a little bit more comfortably. And it does add to the congeniality of the meeting and makes it less of a drag to be there. So
Jesus
food.
had a theology of food, definitely.
Yeah.
Yeah, the issue there is you get in-person meetings. Our session, I am quite lucky to get 2 in-person a year.
Really?
Wow.
So
Yeah, I I did all of my doctoral work on building community. And so I am not a fan when my clerk said I need to like be in person. I was like, great, because I find moderating Zoom meetings to be really hard. And I think there is such a value in being in person. Especially when you're trying to do relational work. So
It's way more exhausting, I find, because you're trying to keep an eye on people and keep everything moving along and make sure things are happening, and you're distracted by wherever you happen to be. Yeah, I think Zoom meetings are way more tiring.
I agree.
yeah, we're in a situation where we have an interim moderator who drives and barely makes it for the meeting. So I have not complained a lot yet, but I am hoping at some point that I can get him to every other or something. I don't know. We've got families with little kids and parents need to be able to be there. And I get it, but boy, it's frustrating. I'd so much prefer to be in person.
When we had, while Eric was on sabbatical, we had someone coming from out of town. He came the first time, but then he joined by Zoom, but we were all in the room in person, which worked fine.
Yeah, I wonder how that worked for the person presiding, being.
Yeah, that's a
But-
tough one.
Well, you'll have to ask him.
Yeah, but in some ways, maybe that's worth it, to have. I mean, in some ways, I get it. If I was the person presiding at that meeting, I'd feel kind of left out, probably not picking up on all the visual cues everyone else is. I mean, if everyone's on Zoom, it's a great equalizer. On the other hand, I think the fact that group was perhaps more cohesive and together, because they're together, might outweigh my discomfort. I think it probably would.
Well, he did come to the first and the last one in
Yes,
person.
okay.
But,
Yeah. Which was helpful, right? I mean,
yes.
what everyone's saying is, I mean, our presbytery has been meeting on Zoom, and I think we're starting to see some of the friction that is because we haven't been in person and we don't know folks. And sometimes you forget that person has spoken before because, or you're sitting near them and you realize that just because they spoke on something you disagreed with, you also noticed because you were in a meeting with them in person that they were nodding along with other things that you agreed with. So you realize people are complicated rather than you see the one issue that they disagreed with you on. And then you somehow probably even subconsciously are vilifying them, or whatever. Maybe that's too strong a term, but I think there is something to be said, being together as much as possible. And at the same time, it's great that you can have a Zoom meeting where there's some quick business to be done between in-person meetings, right? And you just say, hey, we need to get together for 15 minutes. Can we do this on Zoom? I think there's probably a case to be made for that. So, I don't know.
What
do you think, Lori? Is that okay? A few Zoom meetings here and there?
I do Zoom meetings for different things, but for session especially, I'm finding that the in-person matters. Like we do our support ministry on Zoom. we have one person who is always on Zoom, and we did elect them to session. And it's because they are good at Zoom. It works because they are like the super Zoom person, and they will not be left out of the conversation. So I was like, I'm comfortable with this because they're not gonna just be. I've had Zoom people who are traveling who don't participate in the meeting. Like they're just quiet the entire time, and it's like, well, that's not really. It feels like you're not present. So.
Do you ever, if there are people who are quiet, like call on folks and ask them for their opinions, or have you had to do that? Or
I do. I do.
I was afraid of that, Lori. No,
Yeah. No,
not
I
saying you wouldn't.
think that, the other thing we didn't talk about is when somebody's monopolizing the conversation in the room, right? And sort of that deftly switching to say, we is there anybody else who, who would like to speak to the topic? Because we have talkers and we have non-talkers. And I think it's always a assumption that people who aren't talking have nothing to say. And sometimes they can't find their way into the space.
Or they want to be invited.
Right.
And that's easier. It just seems like it's a little more natural in person because you can see them start to open their mouth and then, Thank you, Paul, very much.
Hey, you're
Yeah.
welcome.
Thanks.
This was fun.
Thank you, Paul.
Go ahead.
Aye.
I'm going to send you a note about preaching at Emmanuel. So, keep an eye out.
Okay, well, apparently my email is having issues. You might not hear back from me. No, I'm kidding. I'll get back to you.
Thank you.
Technical difficulties.
Here's the deal. Here's
Take
the deal,
care.
Lori. I'm afraid to say yes to preaching when I've got 2 other people from churches that might then ask me, and I can't say, well, I'm busy. I don't preach anymore, I think I already told Eileen that a couple of times, but
Yeah,
Ah.
and then he finally said yes and got COVID to get out of it.
yeah,
Guy,
I did
Yep.
preach. I preached online. Come on.
I know.
What with COVID? That's something else.
That's
Paul.
dedication.
Yeah,
That's
well,
something
it
else.
was COVID. It was, I was trying to get out.
That was a
Yeah.
good Sunday too. Yeah, you got the full meal deal out of it.
Thanks.
Wow.
Take
All right.
care.
Bye.
See ya.
Bye.
Bye.